great honor to be here today, but a very sad occasion, given the massacre that we've seen at Ashraf and Liberty, given the hostages that have been taken by the al-Maliki regime, given the repression that the regime in Tehran has been practicing. You would think after a certain amount of time people would understand the nature of the mullahs and their objectives. But time and time again they get away with charm offensives that the American media, the Western media more broadly, succumb to without even thinking about it. This is as tragic a circumstance as I can imagine under which we gather. So it's all the more important to continue to make the point that the regime itself is the problem. It's not a few actors who are going beyond their instructions or their mandate. It is the regime itself. And it is why I have long believed, unfortunately contrary to what President Obama said at the United Nations this morning, but why American policy with respect to Iran has to be regime change in Tehran, has to be regime change. Now, this does not mean that the United States itself has to be actively involved. It's the people of Iran that want regime change. The regime is unpopular. It stays in power because of its military capabilities. Everybody has seen that. We saw it in the summer of 2009. We saw it at Ashraf and Liberty, unfortunately, just in the past weeks. So it's critically important to continue to explain to all who will listen that this regime is an authoritarian regime and it's a terrorist regime. The United States State Department has had the Ayatollahs on the list of state sponsors of terrorism for decades, and it's on the list today. Now, it may be that Hassan Rouhani hasn't personally detonated any explosives or pulled the trigger against innocent people recently, but the regime of which he is now a senior official has been doing it for decades, and without that material support, financial support, weapons, the terrorists couldn't conduct their terrorist operations. The regime that supplies terrorists with the weapons of their trade is functionally the equivalent of a terrorist as well. And that's why the notion that a president of the United States would shake hands with a terrorist at the United Nations is repugnant to the overwhelming majority of American citizens, the overwhelming majority of the citizens of Iran. We are in the middle right now of a Hassan Rouhani charm offensive. He has a Twitter account, as if that makes him any less of a terrorist supporter. He's going to do things that make the American media roll over like scratching a cat's tummy. There's no doubt he'll get good publicity for his speech today. But the fact is, Rouhani is a fraud. He knows what he is doing is trying to get relief from the economic sanctions, to relieve pressure on the regime inside Iran. Of course Rouhani wants relief from the sanctions. It's only sensible. But he's not going to make a single concession on the nuclear weapons program. And the critical point to understand here for the American and Western media is that the nuclear weapons in the hands of the Ayatollahs are not simply a threat to the United States, to Israel, to Arab states across the Persian Gulf, to the Middle East as a whole, to the whole world. Nuclear weapons in the hands of the Ayatollahs are a threat to the people of Iran because they constitute the single most important evidence of power to keep the regime in Tehran controlling the country. Once the mullahs get nuclear weapons, it becomes a lot harder for the rest of the world and the people of Iran to dislodge them. So when we talk about the threat of nuclear weapons, it's not simply the external use of nuclear weapons that should concern us, but the impact it will have inside Iran by solidifying the regime in power and making it that much harder to overthrow. And nobody knows this better than Hassan Rouhani. 10 years ago, almost exactly, beginning in 2003, he was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator. And he was extraordinarily successful in his diplomacy, persuading the EU3, Britain, France, and Germany, to negotiate at length about eliminating the nuclear weapons program. Rouhani made what seemed to be concessions, suspensions of the uranium enrichment program, but they were suspensions that were going to occur anyway because the regime had technical and scientific difficulties with uranium conversion and uranium enrichment. So the suspensions were in effect involuntary, but Rouhani was able to extract political and economic concessions from the Europeans. And he got something that he couldn't have obtained any other way. He got time for the regime to fix the problems, to overcome the difficulties, and to continue to make progress. And he gained legitimacy for the Ayatollahs by appearing to engage in a peaceful process of negotiation. Rouhani knows that playbook. He wrote the playbook, and he's got the playbook out again today. And he's simply turning the same pages. So if we see the Perm 5+1 enter into negotiations with the regime again, we will simply enter another likely protracted period where the regime is protected against outside interference, because the White House and the Europeans will not do anything to overthrow the regime while the negotiations are in process. And it will impede the prospects of the people of Iran, the people who are suffering under the mullahs, to carry out their own operations. This, too, Hassan Rouhani knows. At the same time that Rouhani and the Ayatollahs have been supporting the Assad regime in Syria and its use of chemical weapons. Never forget, the Ayatollahs have chemical weapons of their own in Tehran. They have biological weapons. They have unleashed conventional forces against the people of Iran, and if pressed, I don't doubt that they'd resort to chemical weapons as well. This is a dangerous regime in Tehran. It's dangerous to the people of their own country, dangerous to the people of Ashraf and Liberty. They work with the full cooperation of the al-Maliki regime in Iraq, and they're pursuing an objective that the White House simply doesn't want to talk about. I think we should not be considering reducing sanctions against the regime. We should be increasing them. And while we're at it, we should be imposing sanctions on the al-Maliki regime in Iraq, suspending American aid until they do the right thing with Camp Liberty. Entering a very, very dangerous period. A dangerous period for the United States, for the people of the Middle East, and particularly for the people of Iran. But while it may appear discouraging, never forget that as long as the spirit of freedom exists in this country, in Iran, and around the world, ultimately the Ayatollahs will never prevail. And it's important to keep your voices raised to say we will not stop until the regime in Tehran is overthrown. Thank you very much.